What do you do when your point man signals movement that doesn't follow any pattern you've trained for? Not enemy patrol, not supply column. Something else. Something that moves with the jungle instead of through it. You're 3 clicks inside Laos, where American forces officially don't exist. February 1968. Your hand finds your rifle, but you don't know if you're hunter or prey. The trackers closing on your position aren't just good. They're specialists who've been hunting Special Forces teams for 2 years and haven't lost yet. You have 3 seconds to decide. Your men are watching. The mission isn't complete. And there's no manual for this. Staff Sergeant James Keller, 26 years old, Flagstaff, Arizona, felt sweat mixing with camouflage paint as he processed Chen's hand signal. 4 months running recon with MACV-SOG's command and control north. 2 previous extractions under fire. 1 Purple Heart he never mentioned in letters home. Behind him, Specialist Danny Ortega from San Antonio kept radio silence, 22 years old, monitoring frequencies that could mean salvation or death, depending on what he heard. Ahead, Corporal Mike Chen from Sacramento, the best point man in the company, 23, moved with instincts that had kept them alive when doctrine said they should be dead. 3 men. 3 families waiting. 1 mission that should have been simple. But Chen's signal meant the equation had changed. The movement pattern suggested trackers who knew MACV-SOG extraction protocols, who'd studied how Americans think, who were herding them towards something Keller couldn't see yet. If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about missions and body counts. It's about men who executed operations where every choice carried consequences no training could prepare them for. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying decisions that haunt veterans 40 years later. These men operated in denied territory, where courage meant completing the mission, knowing the jungle itself wanted you dead. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into comfortable distance. Because what happened in the next 72 hours would prove that some victories are measured not in ground taken, but in intelligence transmitted and brothers brought home against impossible odds.
Jimmy Keller grew up in Flagstaff, fixing engines in his father's garage, learning that some problems don't have clean solutions. You work with what you have until it holds together. He'd enlisted at 19 not from patriotism, but from knowing that college wasn't his path, and the garage felt too small for questions he couldn't name. The Army gave him purpose. Special Forces gave him brothers. MACV-SOG gave him missions where success meant nobody ever knew you existed. He'd married Linda 2 years earlier in a courthouse ceremony before his first tour. Their daughter Sarah was born January 14, 1968. He'd held her once before deploying, memorized her face, the weight of her in his arms, the promise he made to Linda that he'd come back because their daughter needed to know her father. The Polaroid in his pocket showed Sarah sleeping in Linda's arms. He'd touched that photo every morning for 3 weeks. Danny Ortega had joined a MACV-SOG because sitting in a regular unit felt like watching war instead of fighting it. San Antonio kid who'd grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about Iwo Jima and wanted to prove he had the same spine. Radio was his domain. He could hear patterns in static that others missed, could sense when enemy were triangulating on transmissions. Keller trusted him completely. Mike Chen was the quiet one who moved through jungle like water through stone, finding paths that shouldn't exist. Sacramento-born, parents who'd survived internment camps and taught him that surviving meant paying attention to what others missed. He'd saved Keller's life in a firefight near Khe Sanh by spotting an ambush 3 seconds before it sprung. That's why Keller always put him on point. The three of them had become something more than a team. They'd become brothers who understood that in denied territory, you survived because you trusted each other more than you trusted your own instincts. MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command. Vietnam Studies and Observations Group ran missions that officially didn't happen. Cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia. Intelligence gathering deep in denied territory. Disrupting supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While regular Army units fought conventional battles, MACV-SOG teams operated in the shadows where capture meant torture and execution, because officially, you were never there. By February '68, American strategy relied on intelligence about enemy movements. The Tet Offensive weeks earlier had shattered assumptions about enemy capabilities. Command needed to know what was coming next. MACV-SOG teams like Keller's were America's eyes in territory where satellite imagery showed jungle and ground truth showed enemy buildups that could mean another major offensive. The mission was Reconnaissance. Photograph a suspected supply route, gather intelligence on enemy strength, exfiltrate before detection. Standard MACV-SOG operation. Except this route was 3 kilometers inside Laos, where even other Special Forces units didn't venture. The area was controlled by NVA regulars and Viet Cong trackers who'd spent years learning how Americans operated. But the promise Keller had made to Linda, that he'd come home to their daughter, sat alongside the mission orders. He'd told her that some promises matter more than duty. That Sarah would know her father. That 3 weeks old was too young to lose a dad she'd barely met. What he hadn't told Linda was that his job demanded being exactly where promises became impossible to keep. Stories like these survive not in official records, but because people share them. If you served with reconnaissance teams or knew someone who ran missions where coming home meant beating odds that doctrine said were fatal, the comment section below isn't just a place to type. It's where these memories remain alive. Add yours. Because what men like Keller, Ortega, and Chen faced wasn't about tactics. It was about executing missions where success and survival weren't the same thing. The trackers hunting Keller's team weren't random enemy soldiers. They were specialists from a Viet Cong reconnaissance unit that had spent 2 years studying American Special Forces operations. Their commander, a veteran named Nguyen Van Thieu, had survived French colonial operations and understood that defeating highly trained soldiers required patience, discipline, and intimate knowledge of how they think. These trackers had families in villages along the trail. They'd watched American bombing destroy homes and knew that defending supply routes meant protecting the survival of their people. They weren't wrong to believe they could win. They'd already eliminated 3 MACV-SOG teams using tactics that turned American advantages, air support, communications, firepower, into liabilities. They moved in small groups, avoided patterns, used the jungle as weapon. When they detected Keller's team, they didn't rush to engagement. They maneuvered to positions where Americans couldn't call extraction without triggering ambush. These weren't insurgents. They were professionals executing doctrine that had evolved through brutal experience. North Vietnamese Army regulars preparing the supply route weren't preparing for defense. They were staging for offense. Intelligence suggested a major operation targeting American firebases and ARVN positions. The buildup included artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, and troop concentrations that indicated planning for sustained combat. NVA commanders believed, with justification, that another offensive could break American will to continue the war. Tet had proven American forces could be caught unprepared. This next operation would prove they could be beaten systematically. The soldiers moving supplies believed they were part of liberation, not invasion. Many had marched for weeks from the north. They endured bombing, disease, and exhaustion because they believed their cause was righteous, reunification of Vietnam under their government. That belief made them dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it was genuine. For Keller's team, success meant more than survival. The intelligence they'd gathered, NVA troop concentrations, artillery positions, supply caches, could allow American forces to preempt the offensive, could save hundreds or thousands of lives by striking enemy formations before they attacked. But transmitting that intelligence required remaining in place while setting up communication burst transmission. Minimum 45 minutes exposed while enemy trackers were closing. The tactical stakes were immediate: complete mission or abort and survive. The strategic stakes were massive: intelligence that could shift the operational calculus of the entire theater. The personal stakes cut deeper than duty. Keller had promised Linda he'd prioritize coming home, that Sarah needed a father more than command needed intelligence. But his men trusted him to make calls that honored both mission and brotherhood. That trusted became weight he carried alongside the radio and the photograph. The question wasn't whether they could complete the mission, it was whether completing it meant sacrificing the promise to come home. And Keller didn't have an answer yet. If you're still watching, you already understand something most people don't. Military history isn't about glorifying war. It's about honoring the people who fought them. The trackers closing on Keller's position were skilled professionals defending their homeland. The MACV-SOG team were specialists executing missions their country demanded. Both sides believed they were right. Both sides paid prices that don't appear in casualty reports. Subscribe now and join the community that refuses to let these stories become footnotes. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube these stories deserve to reach people who'll remember them with the complexity they demand. Because what happens next proves that tactical brilliance and strategic necessity sometimes collide with human cost that no doctrine addresses. Keller felt it first through his boots, vibration in earth that shouldn't be there, not footsteps. Pressure waves from movement surrounding their position in synchronized pattern. The jungle floor transmitted information through soil compressed by decades of use, and what Keller felt was coordination. Multiple elements maneuvering with discipline that regular enemy units didn't possess. His hand found Chen's shoulder, signal to freeze, every muscle locked while his mind processed what his body already knew. They'd been detected, and the response wasn't panic or rush, but professional encirclement. The sound grew from silence, not breaking it, but emerging from within it. Leaves shifting without wind, bamboo creaking under careful weight. Bird calls that followed patterns but wrong intervals, communication disguised as jungle noise. Ortega's breathing changed rhythm beside him, recognition that frequencies he monitored were being used to triangulate position. Then Chen heard it clearly. Boot scrape on stone, deliberate, designed to provoke reaction. The trackers were announcing presence, testing whether Americans would break discipline. Keller's heart hammered against ribs, but his breathing stayed controlled because movement now meant death, and stillness meant they might survive the next 60 seconds to reassess. Vision adjusted to shadow patterns and revealed what shouldn't be visible. shapes that weren't jungle but weren't clearly human either. The trackers had positioned themselves in dead ground where MACV-SOG doctrine said enemy couldn't maneuver without exposure. But doctrine was written by people who'd never faced this specific unit, this specific terrain, this specific level of professional competence. Keller counted positions: 3 ahead, 2 flanking, probably 2 behind closing the box. 7 against 3. Mathematics that doctrine said meant immediate extraction, but the radio antenna would give away position the instant Ortega transmitted. The emergency extraction beacon would bring helicopters into ambush that couldn't be suppressed without fire support that would take 8 minutes to arrive. 8 minutes they wouldn't survive. The smell hit Keller's awareness next. Not cordite or jungle rot, but something else. Wood smoke aged in fabric. Fish sauce. The scent of people who lived in this jungle rather than move through it. Close. Within 20 meters. His grandfather had fought in Europe and told him that you could smell enemy before you saw them if you learned what to sense. Keller understood now. The trackers were close enough that their presence changed the air. They were confident enough to let Americans know they were surrounded. Keller's mouth filled with taste, copper from blood he'd bitten from his lip without realizing. Dust mixed with fear, primal understanding that predators had positioned themselves and prey had nowhere to run. His hand found the Polaroid in his pocket, not pulling it out, but touching it through fabric like talisman. Linda's face. Sarah's face, promise that felt more distant than 3 weeks and 7,000 miles. The trackers moved simultaneously. Coordinated assault from 3 directions meant to trigger American response that would expose the rest of the team. Keller signaled, "Don't engage unless fired upon." Chen shifted position to better cover. Movement so slow it took 15 seconds to travel 3 feet. Ortega prepared to transmit burst, 30 seconds of vulnerability while data uploaded. But Keller saw what the trackers didn't. Terrain fold 15 meters northeast that would provide cover if they could reach it without triggering the ambush early. Not escape, repositioning to ground that changed geometry enough to survive initial contact. The Viet Cong team leader signaled his own men to hold fire. Standard doctrine to capture rather than kill because captured MACV-SOG operatives meant intelligence about American operations. But holding fire required discipline his men possessed only if they believed the Americans were trapped without escape. One tracker moved too early, exposed position before the box fully closed. Chen saw it instantly, single enemy combatant visible for 2 seconds. Not the commander who would be positioned in Overwatch, subordinate element. That's when Keller understood what Chen had signaled earlier. The movement pattern wasn't pursuit. It was reconnaissance in force. The trackers weren't hunting blind. They knew MACV-SOG protocols, knew extraction procedures, knew that Americans would establish communications from elevated terrain. They'd predicted position and prepared accordingly. But the intelligence Keller's team had gathered, photos of the supply buildup, documentation of artillery positions, was in the camera pack on Chen's back. Losing that intelligence meant 3 American firebases would face bombardment without warning. Hundreds of casualties because Keller chose survival over mission. His decision tree collapsed into binary choice. Transmit intelligence and accept that extraction might not happen, or abort and let men die who'd never know that information existed that could have saved them. The promise to Linda, the mission, his brothers beside him, the photograph in his pocket. 43 years old now, grown woman with her own daughter. If he didn't make it back, she'd never remember him. But if he abandoned the mission, soldiers with daughters of their own would die without warning. The answer to Chen's earlier signal became clear. The trackers had positioned themselves to prevent extraction, but hadn't realized Americans had already gathered the intelligence, which meant they expected Keller's team to abort, expected them to choose survival. Keller signaled Ortega, "Prepare burst transmission, full data upload." Chen repositioned to provide cover. They'd complete the mission, and they'd either extract afterward or they wouldn't. But the intelligence would transmit. That decision, made in seconds while surrounded by professional trackers who knew American doctrine, would determine whether they saw home again. But that was only the beginning. The burst transmission completed in 28 seconds. Command received full intelligence package, photos, coordinates, troop estimates. Ortega's hands shook as he verified confirmation code. They'd done it. Mission complete. Now they just needed to survive extraction. Keller felt tension release from shoulders he hadn't realized were locked. Chen allowed himself a brief smile. First emotion Keller had seen from him in 3 days. For 60 seconds they existed in space where hardest part was over and they could focus on getting home. Ortega whispered transmission received, helicopter en route, 12 minutes. They'd pulled off missions with tighter timing. The terrain fold provided cover from direct fire. If they could hold position for 12 minutes, they'd board that helicopter and fly out. Keller touched the photograph again, this time allowing himself to believe he'd see Linda and Sarah. That promises weren't always broken by duty, that Sarah would know her father. In that moment, the three of them weren't soldiers executing operations in denied territory. They were men who'd survived another mission that should have killed them. Ortega started planning what he'd eat first stateside. Chen asked if Keller had decided on leave plans. Normal conversation. Brotherhood. The relief felt like oxygen after drowning. Then the radio crackled. Ortega's face went white as transmission came through. Command had analyzed the intelligence. NVA offensive wasn't targeting firebases they'd assumed. 3 American positions would face artillery barrage within 8 hours. But evacuating those positions required confirmation. Second intelligence package from alternate observation point, different angle, visual verification that artillery pieces were positioned for specific trajectories. Without verification, command couldn't justify evacuation that would look like retreat and embolden enemy forces theater-wide. The alternate observation point was 400 meters west, through territory now fully occupied by the trackers who'd just released the perimeter because they'd assumed Americans would abort after transmission. Moving to that position meant re-engaging enemy that command believed had left the area, meant delaying extraction by minimum 40 minutes, meant helicopter would be vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire from NVA positions that would be alerted by American movement. Keller read the request on Ortega's screen. Not an order. Command couldn't order deeper penetration, just request, "Can you verify artillery positions from alternate vantage? Critical intelligence gap. Understand if unable to comply." Translation: 300 American soldiers might die if this intelligence gap wasn't filled. But filling it meant choosing mission over promise, choosing strategic necessity over tactical survival, choosing duty over the photograph in his pocket. Chen looked at him, face carefully neutral. Ortega's hands still shook from adrenaline of the transmission they'd just completed. Neither man would blame Keller for saying no. Mission was complete. They'd earned extraction. The promise to Linda, Sarah, 3 weeks old. The relief they'd felt 60 seconds ago when survival seemed guaranteed. What would you do? Not in theory, not with time to analyze. Right now, your men trust you to make the call. You've already completed the mission command assigned, but 300 American soldiers at 3 fire bases don't know that their positions are targeted, don't know that artillery coordinates are being finalized, don't know they have hours instead of days. You can board the helicopter in 12 minutes and go home. Or you can move 400 meters through enemy territory, gather additional intelligence, and hope the helicopter can still extract you 40 minutes later when NVA forces are fully alert. Your wife is waiting. Your daughter doesn't know you yet. Your men have families too. What do you do? Keller looked at Chen, at Ortega, at the radio showing extraction helicopter inbound, at the photograph in his pocket that he didn't pull out because he couldn't let them see him hesitate. He thought about the promise to Linda, about Sarah growing up without a father, about 300 soldiers with families who'd die without warning if this intelligence gap remained. He made the choice every MACV-SOG operator feared, completing one mission by accepting another that might make the first mission meaningless if you didn't survive. We move to alternate observation point. Chen, plot route that minimizes exposure. Ortega, advise command we're obtaining verification. Extraction delayed 45 minutes. Neither man questioned. They'd known his answer before he'd spoken, because they would have made the same choice. The mission wasn't complete until the intelligence reached the people who could act on it, and acting required certainty that command didn't have. The promise Keller made to Linda, that he'd prioritize coming home to Sarah, shattered the moment he signaled Chen to move out. Because some choices don't honor promises, they honor the knowledge that other men have daughters too. And those daughters deserved fathers who came home because someone transmitted intelligence that prevented artillery barrages. The choice was made. The consequences were just beginning. The alternate observation point revealed what command needed. NVA artillery positions dug into hillside with firing coordinates pre-plotted for the 3 American fire bases. Chen photographed trajectories, while Keller counted gun tubes, 12 artillery pieces, ammunition stacked in bunkers, fire direction equipment. This wasn't harassment. This was preparation for sustained bombardment designed to destroy American positions before ground assault. The intelligence was definitive, but movement below stopped Keller cold. NVA regulars, not the trackers but combat infantry, moved into positions surrounding the observation point. Platoon strength, maybe more. They weren't responding to Keller's team. They were establishing security for the artillery positions. Standard doctrine. But it meant Americans were now surrounded by 30-plus enemy combatants who'd discover them the moment transmission equipment activated. Worse, the helicopter approaching for extraction would fly directly over NVA positions. Command didn't know the artillery had infantry security, didn't know that extraction point was now compromised. The helicopter crew, 4 Americans who'd volunteered for MACV-SOG support knowing the survival rate, were flying into anti-aircraft fire they couldn't anticipate. Ortega whispered the situation to command. Response came back. Abort if unable to transmit safely. Do not compromise helicopter. Translation: command valued their lives over the intelligence. But 300 soldiers at those fire bases didn't have the option to abort. They were already committed to positions that would be hit within hours. Keller processed the tactical geometry. NVA infantry hadn't detected them yet, but would within minutes as security patrols established. The trackers had likely reported American presence, and regulars were responding with protocol: secure artillery, establish perimeter, search and destroy, professional execution. The helicopter was 8 minutes out. Transmission required 4 minutes for full data package, which meant they needed to hold position under enemy noses, transmit while exposed, then move to extraction under fire from forces that would be fully alerted. Mathematics said it was impossible. Doctrine said abort. Survival instinct said run. But Keller thought about the artillerymen below preparing bombardment of American positions and realized those enemy soldiers were doing their job with same professionalism he tried to maintain. They weren't wrong to defend their positions, but the American firebases weren't wrong to exist. War wasn't about right and wrong. It was about choices that both sides made because failure wasn't acceptable. Chen positioned to provide cover. Ortega prepared transmission. Keller made decision that defined MACV-SOG operations. They'd complete the mission because refusing to quit when quitting was the only logical choice was the only way they knew how to operate. The transmission began. 4 minutes of vulnerability while NVA infantry patrols closed. Chen counted positions. 3 squads establishing perimeter. 1 squad moving directly toward American location. 30 seconds until discovery. The photographs uploaded in agonizing slow sequence, each image rendering then transmitting while Keller watched enemy soldiers advance. Ortega's screen showed upload progress, 40%, 50%. Enemy squad leader signaled his men to spread search pattern, 60%. Chen's hand tightened on rifle. He'd seen the Americans first, could engage before they alerted others, but firing would bring entire NVA force down on position before transmission completed. 70%. Enemy soldier 5 meters from their position, scanning jungle. 80%. The soldier turned toward them, squinting through foliage that barely concealed 3 Americans. 90%. Chen made decision. Fired suppressed single shot that dropped the soldier before he could alert others. Sound was quiet but not silent. Other enemy soldiers reacted, searching for source. Ortega finished transmission, confirmed receipt, grabbed radio pack. They moved immediately, not toward extraction, but toward dense terrain that would break enemy line of sight. NVA infantry responded exactly as doctrine demanded, suppressing fire toward contact point, flanking elements maneuvering to encircle, radio calls bringing additional forces. But Americans weren't where enemy expected. Chen's route plan exploited terrain fold that channeled pursuers into linear movement, negating numerical advantage temporarily. Keller signaled, parallel to enemy advance, not away from it. Counterintuitive, but it broke pursuit pattern long enough for them to reposition. The game had changed. Intelligence was transmitted. Helicopter was inbound to compromised extraction point. NVA forces were fully alerted, and 3 Americans needed to reach that helicopter without leading enemy forces directly to it. The mission had succeeded. Whether they'd survive that success wasn't determined yet. But Keller felt something shift. Not fear, but clarity. They'd done what command needed. The firebases would receive warning. Artillery bombardment would hit empty positions or fortified defenses. Hundreds of lives saved because 3 men transmitted intelligence while surrounded. Whether history remembered them didn't matter. The soldiers they'd saved would never know their names. That was fine. Some victories aren't celebrated. They're measured in casualties prevented and families who'd never know how close they came to grief. The question command asked, could they verify artillery positions, was answered. The intelligence that closed the gap between suspicion and certainty was now in command's hands. Keller's team had filled a role that only existed because America fought wars where success meant preventing enemy attacks that would never happen. The trackers and NVA infantry weren't villains. They were professionals executing their doctrine. But preventing American casualties required beating those professionals at tasks where losing meant death. Victory came, but the cost was still being counted. The extraction helicopter took fire 300 meters from landing zone. Door gunner returned suppressing fire while pilot fought controls through turbulence that wasn't weather but RPG concussion. Keller's team reached the zone running full sprint through jungle that tore skin and left blood trail enemy would follow. Chen made it aboard. Ortega made it aboard. Keller took hit in left shoulder as he grabbed the skid. Bones shattered, but adrenaline kept him conscious while crew chief hauled him up. The helicopter lifted through ground fire that punched holes in fuselage but missed critical systems. They'd made it. Barely. But the NVA soldier Chen shot at the observation point. Later intelligence identified him as Private Nguyen Van Duc, 23 years old from a village near Hanoi. Married 6 months. He died instantly. Professional soldier doing his job. His squad leader found the body and realized Americans had penetrated security perimeter, meaning artillery positions were compromised. The bombardment plan was altered, delayed, then eventually canceled because American forces evacuated the targeted firebases within hours of Keller's intelligence reaching command. Nguyen Van Duc's death accomplished the mission he'd been assigned. His squad had maintained security, but his loss devastated the men who'd served with him. 2 helicopter crewmen were wounded by ground fire. Both survived. One lost hearing in left ear permanently. The other carried shrapnel in his leg for 40 years until surgical removal. Neither man regretted the extraction. Both remembered Keller's team as the bloodiest pickup they'd run in 23 months of MACV-SOG support operations. American casualties at the 3 fire bases that would have been targeted. 0, because the artillery bombardment never happened. 300 soldiers went home to families who never knew how close they'd come to receiving notifications of death in combat. The intelligence Keller transmitted prevented casualties that statisticians could count but would never attribute to specific source. Those soldiers lived. Many later had children, grandchildren, whole lines of families existing because 3 MACV-SOG operators completed mission that doctrine said was impossible. The cost appeared in casualty reports as minor: 1 American wounded, 1 NVA killed, 2 helicopter crew injuries. Mathematics that didn't capture what actually happened. The landing zone after extraction showed blood trail from Keller's shoulder wound. Equipment scattered where they'd moved under fire. Shell casings from Chen's single shot. The terrain held memory of men running for their lives while completing mission that mattered more than survival. Days later, rain would wash the blood away. Jungle would reclaim the space. Birds would return to trees that had shook with gunfire. But inside the helicopter evacuating them to field hospital, Keller stared at his hands, blood mixing with mud and exhaustion. The photograph in his pocket was soaked with sweat and blood. Sarah's face barely visible through moisture damage. Linda's face smudged. The promise he'd made looked different now. He'd survived. But the man who boarded that helicopter wasn't the man who'd made the promise. Something had died in those hours between transmission and extraction. Not courage or skill, but the certainty that promises could be kept if you were good enough, fast enough, careful enough. Chen sat across from him, face blank, processing whatever combat does to men who kill professionally and carry that weight forever. Ortega clutched the radio pack like lifeline, knowing that transmission had saved hundreds, but cost 1 NVA soldier who'd been defending his position exactly as orders demanded. The moral mathematics didn't balance. Good guys and bad guys was language that didn't apply to situations where both sides served with honor and dying didn't care about which flag you saluted. Keller realized the promise to Linda was broken, not by dying but by surviving, because the man who came home would carry weight she couldn't see, knowledge that completing the mission required choosing duty over the promise, that Sarah would have a father, but not the father who'd left. War had changed that equation permanently. The photograph dried eventually. Sarah's face remained barely visible. For decades, Keller carried it not as reminder of promise kept, but as evidence of cost paid. The intelligence transmitted saved lives. The decision to transmit it broke something that healing never fully restored. Both truths existed simultaneously. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to years, and the weight never got lighter. It just became familiar enough that carrying it felt normal. 43 years later, Staff Sergeant James Keller, now 69 years old, still wakes at 0300 from dreams that aren't memories, but reconstructions of moments his mind has processed 10,000 times. The shoulder wound healed, but arthritis lives in shattered bone. Weather forecast that predicts rain before clouds form. He attended veteran reunions where men who'd served with MACV-SOG shared stories they couldn't tell families. He tried therapy 3 times over decades, quit twice, stuck with it the 3rd time because Sarah asked him to. She'd grown up knowing her father carried weight, but not understanding its source until she was 30, and he finally explained what happened in February 1968. Danny Ortega returned stateside, married, raised 3 children, worked construction for 40 years. He couldn't sleep in rooms without windows, needed sight lines that allowed scanning terrain. His wife understood eventually. His children learned not to approach suddenly. The radio pack he'd carried weighed 5 pounds, but felt heavier every year after. Mike Chen left the Army after his 2nd tour, became a teacher, never discussed his service until a student's grandfather recognized his unit designation on a cap worn to school. Chen spoke to that class once about what it meant to serve, kept it simple. Courage isn't absence of fear, it's completing the mission while terrified. The student's grandfather had been at one of the firebases that intelligence saved. He thanked Chen, who didn't know how to respond. He served honorably. His brothers served honorably. Private Nguyen Van Duke, that young NVA soldier defending artillery positions, served honorably too. They all did what they believed was right, with courage and skill that deserves recognition. The fault, when there was fault, lay in strategy and policy, in decisions made far from battlefields by people who would never carry the cost. The soldiers did their part. The question is whether the leaders did theirs. The trackers who hunted Keller's team were defending their homeland with same dedication Americans brought to protecting fellow soldiers. Both sides believed their causes justified sacrifice. Both sides paid prices in blood, trauma, and questions that outlive wars. War creates heroes on all sides. It also creates tragedies on all sides. The courage of one doesn't diminish the courage of the other. Both can be true. Both should be remembered. The photograph of Sarah that Keller carried is framed now in his home. Blood-stained, faded, but preserved. Sarah has a daughter who will never meet the grandfather who left for Vietnam, but will know the grandfather who came back changed. The intelligence transmitted in February '68 prevented casualties that statistics count but don't name. Keller knows this. It doesn't make the weight lighter, it makes it meaningful. Some missions succeed not because of what you gain, but because of what you refuse to lose. Brothers, duty, the knowledge that intelligence matters and lives can be saved if you're willing to pay the price that doctrine says is too high. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars.